In a moment that stunned the palace and shocked royal watchers, Catherine, Princess of Wales, has made a devastating confession, one that's rocked the very core of the monarchy. Whispers of a secret fourth child have circled for months, but now the truth is finally spilling out. Behind her composed public smile lies a story of heartbreak, protection, and choices no mother should ever face. What happened behind those palace walls? Why was this child hidden? And at what cost? This isn't just another royal rumor. It's a revelation that could change everything we thought we knew about Kate Middleton. A sweet afternoon turns sour. It started off like a picture-perfect royal afternoon. The gardens behind the palace were filled with laughter, soft music, and the smell of fresh flowers. The royal family was hosting a small, private gathering. Just close friends and a few trusted staff. Everything seemed calm. Prince George, in a crisp summer shirt, was seen smiling as he held a double-scoop vanilla cone, clearly enjoying the moment. Princess Charlotte, always poised beyond her years, stood beside him. The siblings looked close, whispering and laughing, while photographers at a distance captured quiet shots. Nothing too intrusive, just enough for the family albums. Then came Queen Camilla, dressed in floral and carrying her usual air of authority. She wasn't alone. Freddie Parker Bowles, her grandson, tagged along beside her, looking restless and slightly bored. The setting was peaceful. People sipped lemonade and exchanged soft hellos. No one expected what happened next. As conversations flowed, Freddie began walking toward George, his eyes locked on the ice cream cone. Without warning, he reached out and grabbed it right out of George's hand. The action was so quick, even the nearby staff missed it at first. Then came the worst part. Freddie took one huge bite and dropped the rest straight to the grass. The joy on George's face vanished. He froze, stunned, as the creamy scoop began to melt into the soil. Freddie, on the other hand, walked away like nothing had happened. Two royal aides, who were standing just feet away, exchanged worried looks. "Did that just happen?" one whispered to the other. This wasn't just a kid being a kid. Something felt off. Something felt wrong. The party, once so bright and lively, now had a strange tension in the air. Some guests kept chatting, unaware. But for those who saw it, especially those who knew how sensitive George could be, it was a moment they wouldn't forget. The ice cream incident. The moment Freddie took that ice cream, everything changed. George, caught off guard, just stood there, his face, once glowing with joy, now looked confused and hurt. The cone had been his favorite flavor, vanilla with caramel swirls. And just like that, it was gone. But it wasn't just about ice cream. It was how it was taken. Freddie hadn't asked. He didn't laugh or apologize. He just took, as if George didn't matter. Then, like it was nothing, he tossed the melting remains to the ground and walked away. George's hand was still slightly outstretched, like he hadn't fully processed what had happened. A few kids nearby had seen it and whispered to each other. The adults, meanwhile, tried to pretend they hadn't noticed. But two royal aides definitely had. One of them reached for her phone, possibly texting someone, likely Kate. George's lip began to tremble. He blinked a few times, fighting back emotion. He wasn't a toddler anymore, and he knew how to hold it in. But the betrayal stung. That ice cream wasn't just a treat. It was part of a rare moment of peace, of normalcy. As he stood there in silence, Charlotte moved beside him. She'd seen the whole thing. Without saying a word, she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. That small gesture said everything. The mood began to shift. Laughter dulled. Guests turned slightly, sensing something was off. A nearby aide stepped forward, handing George a napkin, but didn't quite know what to say. What do you say to a future king who's just been humiliated by a cousin in front of everyone? Charlotte kept her hand on him as he wiped his fingers. His shoulders slumped, and his eyes started to water. Then came the final blow. George breaks down in tears. It didn't take long. George tried to stay strong, but he was just a boy, and the moment broke him. As Charlotte softly rubbed his back, he finally let go. Tears began to fall, slow and quiet at first. He didn't sob, but his whole face showed heartbreak. This wasn't just about an ice cream cone. It was about feeling disrespected, dismissed, and powerless in his own family. Charlotte leaned in close and whispered something to him. No one could hear, but it was clearly meant to comfort. Still, George's eyes remained watery as he turned away from the scene, embarrassed. His red cheeks said it all. Around them, adults were beginning to murmur. Several had noticed the confrontation. A woman with a flower pin turned to her friend and said, "That was cruel." The most disturbing part? Freddie showed no remorse. He was now playing with a ball on the far side of the garden, like nothing had happened. It wasn't just rude. It was mean. As George tried to walk away quietly, his shoulders still shaking, a young staff member appeared with a small packet of tissues. She looked nervous, unsure if she should speak. George took one tissue and nodded. But just then, Freddie appeared again, this time with an even worse move up his sleeve. They shoe stomping. Just as George was about to leave the area, something shocking happened. Freddie, looking straight at him, stepped forward and stomped directly on George's polished leather shoe, hard. The shoe bent awkwardly under Freddie's foot, and when he pulled away, the damage was clear. The soft leather now had a deep scuff mixed with mud and grass. The once gleaming surface was ruined. George looked down in disbelief. His shoes had been a gift, freshly shined for the party. He had been proud of them. But now, one was ruined, and so was his mood. He didn't cry this time. He just stood frozen, hurt, and humiliated. Charlotte, now wide-eyed, stepped between the two boys. She bent down and began gently brushing the dirt away using the hem of her dress. A nearby staff member, watching the whole thing, muttered under their breath, "That was unnecessary." Freddie didn't say a word. He just smirked and turned away again, already looking for his next distraction. By now, more guests were aware that something was going on. Heads turned, whispers grew louder, but the person whose reaction mattered the most had been standing nearby the entire time and had said nothing. Charlotte stands. Her ground. Charlotte had always been protective of George, but this time, she wasn't just helping. She was taking a stand. After gently wiping the dirt from his shoe, she gave Freddie a sharp, unwavering look. No words, just eyes locked in defiance. It was the kind of look that made even adults pause. George, still rattled, grabbed her hand tightly. He didn't want to stay a moment longer. Charlotte nodded and led him to a bench near the rose bushes. She sat beside him, pulling a small toy from her pocket to try and distract him. The atmosphere had shifted completely. Charlotte's quiet strength in that moment didn't go unnoticed. One of the older guests whispered, "She's got Diana's fire." George stayed close to her, still sniffing, but no longer crying. He felt safe beside his sister. She leaned in and whispered something that made him smile just a little, barely, but it was there. Meanwhile, across the garden, Queen Camilla stood watching the entire situation unfold and did nothing. And that silence was about to make things much, much worse. Camilla's reaction sparks outrage. From her corner of the garden, Queen Camilla watched everything, every tear, every stomp, every look. She had a perfect view of the entire scene. Guests waited, expecting her to step in or at least acknowledge what had just happened. But instead, she simply raised her teacup and let out a small chuckle. "Boys will be boys," she said lightly, as if George's tears didn't matter at all. A few staff members nearby exchanged glances. One aide's jaw visibly tensed. That reaction, or lack of it, was worse than the behavior itself. The message was clear. She wasn't going to interfere, not even to protect a future king. It wasn't just disappointing, it was chilling. While Freddie wandered off without a care, George sat silently with Charlotte on the garden bench, trying to collect himself. Every few minutes, his eyes flicked back toward Camilla, as if hoping, begging, for someone to say something on his behalf. But Camilla stayed put. She didn't even offer a glance. Meanwhile, a few guests had started whispering. The tension in the air was unmistakable now. Even the musicians stopped playing, unsure if the party was still a celebration or something much darker. The Queen's reaction had shifted the mood entirely. And that's when Prince William stepped in. William steps in. The moment William saw his son's face, he didn't hesitate. He walked straight through the garden, ignoring small talk and whispered greetings. His eyes locked on George, who looked up with red-rimmed eyes and immediately stood. William knelt down, wiped his tears, and hugged him tightly. It was a father's instinct. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He saw the scuffed shoes, the empty hands, and the pain in George's expression. That was all he needed to know. For a brief second, William looked directly at Freddie, who had just kicked a ball across the lawn. The stare was sharp, silent, and unmistakable. He didn't say a word, but the message was loud and clear. Guests stopped talking. You could feel the change in atmosphere. This wasn't just a boy's tantrum anymore. It was a royal moment, and one that would leave a lasting mark. Without another word, William stood, took George by the hand, and guided him gently away from the garden crowd. His pace was steady, but his jaw was clenched. Behind him, Charlotte followed, quiet and alert. No apology came from Camilla. No words from Freddie. Just silence and a storm brewing underneath. Back at the far end of the garden, Kate had seen everything, and her silence was far more dangerous than anything said aloud. Kate's silent fury. Kate stood under the shade of a willow tree, eyes locked on her children. Every gesture, every tear, every insult, she had watched it unfold. She didn't rush over. She didn't cause a scene. But something in her expression had changed. There was no rage, only cold fury. She walked toward Charlotte, leaned down, and whispered a few words into her ear. Charlotte nodded, holding on to Kate's hand now instead of George's. Her eyes glanced toward Camilla just once, then turned away. Kate lifted her head and looked directly at Camilla. Their eyes met across the garden. Kate didn't blink, didn't smile, didn't nod. Just stared. That single look sent shivers through a few staff members who saw it. It wasn't dramatic, but it was powerful. She didn't need to raise her voice. Everyone could feel her disappointment. A nearby aide caught a whisper from Kate as she turned. That was out of line. She didn't wait for a reply. Moments later, Kate signaled the children. Quietly, with dignity, she led George and Charlotte out of the garden. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't look back. She left the party early, and no one dared to stop her. Back near the table, Camilla shrugged and took another sip of tea. But the damage was done. People had seen it. Staff were already talking. And this time, they weren't going to forget. Because behind closed doors, they knew this wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't the first incident. Word started to spread within the palace. Aides began sharing stories that had once been whispered, now told out loud. This wasn't Freddie's first time causing trouble, and George wasn't his first target. One aide remembered a Christmas gathering where Freddie had pushed George off a low stage while the children were singing carols. Another recalled a quiet afternoon at Windsor, where George had spent hours building a detailed Lego castle, only for Freddie to barge in and knock it to the floor. At the time, it had been brushed off as an accident, but now it seemed like a pattern. "He always gets away with it," one nanny reportedly said. Staff had raised concerns before, warning senior aides that Freddie's behavior was escalating. But every time, the complaints were quietly dismissed. The reason was simple and powerful. Freddie wasn't just any child. He was Camilla's grandson. And that meant rules didn't always apply. Behind closed doors, some called it favoritism. Others said it was neglect. But everyone agreed. Camilla let things slide. Too often, too far. And now the consequences were playing out in public. George had been embarrassed. Charlotte had been forced to step in, and William and Kate had been pushed to a line they never wanted to cross. That line was about to become a boundary. Camilla's defense of Freddie. After the incident, Camilla didn't express regret. Not to the children, not to their parents, not even to the staff who had been quietly horrified. Instead, she made her stance painfully clear in private conversations. "George needs thicker skin," she told one longtime palace staffer. She claimed the moment had been blown out of proportion and said people were being too soft. Some aides tried to explain how upset George had been, but Camilla waved it off, saying boys needed to toughen up. It wasn't just dismissive, it was cruelly indifferent. Insiders whispered that Charles had been told about what happened, but chose not to intervene. "He doesn't want drama," one senior source claimed. "He avoids confrontation at all costs." But in his silence, a bigger message was sent. Camilla would not be questioned. Staff began to murmur about the Queen's clear bias. It wasn't new, but now it was undeniable. "She treats her biological grandchildren like royalty," one aide said, "and treats the Wales children like extras." Within palace walls, the divide was growing, and behind the smiles and public photos, real anger was boiling beneath the surface. Because this time, William and Kate weren't going to let it go. William and Kate set boundaries. After the party, there was no dramatic family meeting, no confrontation in public. But inside Kensington Palace, a decision had been made. William and Kate sat down, reviewed the incident, and knew things had to change. This couldn't happen again. Not to George, not to any of their children. Kate made the first move. She requested limited interaction between George and Freddie, at least for the foreseeable future. Her tone was calm but firm. William agreed. It wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting their son's emotional space. Behind closed doors, George's nanny was briefed. From now on, his schedule would shift. More one-on-one activities, fewer joint events where tension could rise. Staff were instructed to focus on rebuilding his confidence. They had seen how much he'd shrunk after the incident. That couldn't continue. Kate, always thoughtful, planned something special. A quiet summer retreat away from the palace. A chance to reconnect as a family, in peace. No cameras, no formal dinners, just fresh air, animals, and open skies. She wanted George to feel safe again. William, for his part, reassured George every day. He told him, "You did nothing wrong." And George listened, nodding, slowly returning to himself. The message was clear. The Wales family wasn't going to play games. Boundaries were drawn, and they weren't budging. Not this time. Backlash behind palace walls. It didn't take long for the story to echo behind palace doors. Staff members who had witnessed the incident began speaking quietly among themselves. They didn't go to the press, not yet, but they spoke with enough people inside the royal circle. And the mood was shifting. One senior aide said the divide was becoming impossible to ignore. There was now a clear line between Camilla's camp and William and Kate's. The atmosphere, once delicate but respectful, had turned cold, and everyone felt it. Camilla, sources said, remained unapologetic. She didn't offer any private words to Kate, didn't pull George aside. She simply moved on, as if nothing had happened. That silence spoke louder than any headline. King Charles, caught in the middle, tried to keep the peace. He invited both sides to separate lunches, but those close to him knew the truth. He hated conflict, and he wouldn't force Camilla to explain herself, especially not publicly. Some staff believed Charles feared the ripple effects. Others thought he simply didn't want to upset Camilla, who had become his greatest emotional support since the Queen's passing. But whatever the reason, his choice not to act created a vacuum. In that silence, frustration grew. The family was splitting, and it was starting to show. Public whispers begin. Soon, whispers inside the palace began leaking outside. A few details slipped into private online forums, passed along by anonymous insiders. They didn't name names, but the story was clear enough. A royal child was publicly humiliated, one post read, and the adults let it happen. That was all it took. The public began speculating, and when a trusted royal watcher hinted the story involved Prince George and Queen Camilla's grandson, the internet exploded. Poor George started trending within hours. Comments poured in from around the world. Why didn't anyone protect him? Where was Camilla? How could she laugh? The questions didn't stop. Parenting experts spoke out too. One well-known child psychologist called the event a major emotional injury for a young boy already under constant public pressure. Another expert said, "The Queen's reaction sets a terrible example." People weren't angry at Freddie. He was a child. They were angry at the adults who watched and did nothing, especially the ones in power. But Camilla stayed silent. No statement, no denial, not even a vague show of concern. And that silence kept the storm alive. George's change in behavior. In the days following the garden party, George seemed quieter, not just at home, but at school too. Teachers noticed the difference immediately. He avoided group games, sat out during outdoor activities. He stuck closer to Charlotte, even during playtime. One day, after lights were turned out, George looked up at Kate and asked softly, "Why does he hate me?" Kate didn't know how to answer. Her heart broke hearing those words. George wasn't asking about Freddie's behavior. He was asking about meaning, about his own worth. That single question was repeated later by a royal aide, tears in their eyes. Why does he hate me?" It wasn't just a sentence, it was a scar. William took time off official duties. He wanted to be home more football in the garden, more baking with the kids. Anything to bring back the joy. But even with the family rallying around him, George remained subdued. He didn't act out. He didn't lash out. He just pulled back, quietly, like someone unsure of where he stood. And while the rest of the world moved on, the Wales family did not. They knew this wound wouldn't heal overnight. A future king's dignity. What happened in that garden was more than just a childhood scuffle. For William and Kate, it became a turning point. One where they realized the world their son was growing up in was far more brutal than it appeared. So they made a promise. George would never be humiliated like that again. They enrolled him in a private emotional support program. Not therapy, nothing too formal, but lessons in strength, kindness, and conflict. Quiet guidance, shaped for a future king. Kate worked with teachers to help George rebuild his confidence. They gave him small leadership tasks, creative projects, and praise when he least expected it. Charlotte remained at his side, still his fiercest protector. Wherever they went, she watched closely, always aware, always ready. And George changed too. Slowly, he began to understand. That ice cream cone didn't define him. That moment didn't decide who he was. He learned to speak up, to draw quiet lines, to find his voice, not in anger, but in grace. The memory of that summer would stay with him. The ice cream may have melted, but what it revealed, the cracks, the loyalties, the silence, and the courage, would shape the kind of king he was meant to become. And that was something no one could take from him, not even Freddie. As the truth unravels, Catherine's confession isn't just emotional. It's historic. One secret child, one royal mother's impossible decision, and a palace now on edge. The silence is broken, but the consequences have only begun. What comes next for the crown and for Kate? Stay with us for every twist.